Good afternoon. I want to thank everybody who joins us. My name is Olga Tamanova, and Ukraine Media Center Ukrinform continues its operation. Today it's been 9 years of the war, and today is day 407 of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by Russian occupiers. And now we will be talking about the situation in Sumy region. Joining us online is Savchenko, acting military governor of Sumy region. Good afternoon, Mr. Taras. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. Mr. Taras, let's start our conversation with the situation in the region. Are the shellings still going on? What are the consequences? Yes, unfortunately, the shellings are still going on a daily basis. Every day we have from 15 to 20 shellings. For your understanding, it's about 150. For example, yesterday it was 230 different projectiles incoming from different types of weapons. For example, yesterday within 24 hours we were experiencing the mortar strikes, the MLRS strikes, the strikes by cannon artillery, specifically the self-propelled. Also, there were droppings of the explosive devices from unmanned aerial vehicles. There were shellings with the use of anti-tank weapons, anti-tank rockets. So the enemy uses all the range of weapons against the civil population. Mostly they target the settlements and sometimes the centers of the settlements. Most Bilopillo community suffers the most. It's located in the central part of Sumy region, but at the same time 15 communities which are located along the border with Russia end up under shellings on a daily basis. As to the losses of civil population, the day before yesterday there were 2 people injured. One was injured in Krasnopillo community. By the way, it was a medic who was injured during the drop of the explosive device from unmanned aerial vehicle. And in Snopria community, another person was injured this week, but fortunately not so heavily. The last losses were in the end of the last week, when the enemy cowardly targeted the expediter and the driver of a milk truck. So there were civilians. The milk truck cannot be confused with any military vehicle or any other vehicle which can be used for military purposes. So first there was an explosion of an explosive device, and then those people were targeted by the enemy shell in a cynical manner. So this is the situation in the region. Mr. Taras, talking about the communities which are along the borderline, what is the situation there? I mean, do the locals stay there, or do they mostly get evacuated, and are there still children remaining there? Yes, the situation is as follows. We control the 5-kilometer zone in the depth from the border of Russia, because the majority of the shellings of the settlements is happening there within this depth of 5 kilometers. There is like a couple dozens of settlements where the local population is still staying. We understand that in the Sumy region there is maybe up to 10 settlements, maybe a little bit more, from which the people evacuated completely, but in the majority of villages the civilians still stay. The specificity of Sumy region is that a number of quite big settlements where more than 100, where a couple of hundred people reside, they are located quite in the borderline. Like the border goes right along the street of this or that village or town. This is why people stay in this area close to the border. Along with the local government, we organized the personal visits to their homes. We know the number of civilians staying there. They were handed the leaflets where it's described how to react to the shelling. There is a telephone, the hotline telephone number. They were communicated the information from the local government. Their phone numbers were collected, so they're in touch in case of emergency. For example, in winter we had a situation when the enemy started shelling the avenues of approach to one of the villages, and they targeted a truck which was carrying supplies, and that road was destroyed and the village was cut off the communication. So the military used their vehicles to deliver the medicines, the food and basic necessity products. But in order to operate, in order to react to the situation in a prompt manner, we need to know who is staying in which village. We try to convince the civilians, specifically in those regions where the shellings are more intense. We identify the areas where they can be relocated. Fortunately, it's a small fraction of our population. I'm not giving you the exact number intentionally, but we are ready to relocate them within the Sumy region. The majority of them can stay within their communities or their districts, but they are mostly elderly people who have their land plots, they have their local agricultural economy working there. But we try to convince them, we try to communicate all the necessary information to them. So the situation is basically under control, and we react promptly in case of jeopardization. Mr. Taras, do we understand it correct that due to the proximity of the enemy, those people, they almost have no time to hide into the shelter, to get a safe shelter in place, that the shellings sometimes are quite intense and they have no time to hide? Well, the situation in fact is not that critical, because the villages that I mentioned, they are in rural area. They are small settlements where there are no apartment blocks. Sometimes there are two-story buildings, but the majority of the buildings are the small private houses, and they have their own cellars which can be used as shelters. Local population, I mean those who decided to stay there, they are already in touch with the local military, who can warn them about the threat of a shelling, and they react to this sound of the outgoing projectile, and they know where the projectile may be incoming. And frequently the shellings are not targeting the villages themselves, but mostly the outskirts. And there are no situations when some settlements are being incessantly shelled. There are some hot sectors, obviously, which end up under shellings on a constant manner, so people mostly got relocated from there. As to the children, unfortunately, there are families, well, the majority of the families with children left. We evacuated them in a centralized manner. We evacuated all the institutions where children were kept on a permanent or temporary basis. For example, the people with limited capabilities, or some institutions for children, so some educational institutions. There are still some families with children left there, but again, for Sumy region, the regulation on mandatory evacuation doesn't work, is not in effect. There should be a decision taken by the parents or the foster parents, but again, we know where those children are. We communicate with the parents or the foster parents. They have their automobiles, and they say that in case of jeopardization of situation, they would evacuate. So we are in permanent touch with them. So talking about the situation with critical infrastructure in the region, what is it now? The situation is normal. Basically, the majority of consumers, I would say 98%, they have normal electric power supply. 1 or 2% of consumers who don't have normal power supply, they are in those villages that are under constant shellings. And if the security situation doesn't allow to reestablish power supply, sometimes the repair teams cannot go there due to security situation, and they cannot repair the gas supply or the electric power supply. But in fact, we're talking about like a couple of dozens of suppliers. They don't have power supply, but again, if there are no critical damages to the critical infrastructure, for example, if the gas supply cannot be reestablished for one single building, or the building is not destroyed, if it doesn't happen on part of the consumer, so within a day, when the security situation allows to do so, the gas supply and electric power supply are being reestablished just within 1 day. But again, since it's a rural area, there is no centralized water supply. Well, you understand, they have diversified infrastructure. In this sense, they have wells where they take water from. There are certain villages where the water supply is centralized. It operates normally. Fortunately, this infrastructure is located underground, not above the ground, so it doesn't suffer significant damages. So with the exclusions that I just mentioned, people have normal access to utility services, and the critical infrastructure in the region operates normally and provides the necessary services to the population. Thank you. Good afternoon. Olga Panasenko, Ukrinform. You mentioned that the people, even under the territories under shellings, they work on their land plots already. So I'm having a question in this regard. What is generally the situation with the agriculture in Sumy region in view of the mining, in view of the shellings? To what extent the organized large-scale agricultural works can be performed in this area? Thank you. Thank you for your question. Dear colleagues, I would like to emphasize, well, please don't have this impression that Sumy region is under shellings all the time. We're all sitting in the cellars or shelters and the life is frozen there. Well, I'm talking about actually about the territory in the depth of 5 to 10 kilometers from the border. The rest of the Sumy region keeps recovering, keeps developing, and there is an active phase of agricultural works going on in the region. We established the coordination headquarters. We coordinate and with the state emergency service, with emergency. We are in touch with the suppliers of the fertilizers, of the fuel. We got them all together to make sure that the sowing campaign this year passes just as well as it did last year. Last year we were deoccupied. The enemy was ousted from Sumy region on the 4th of April, and regardless all those circumstances that some time was lost, still Sumy region managed to sow 98% of the agricultural areas, 93% of the territories that were sown during before in the pre-war time, before the 24th of February. So this year forecast is to sow less territory due to dense mining, due to the shellings, well, including mining by our military, because we understand that part of the area along the border is being mined by us. So since the demining is not yet accomplished, since the last year, part of those lands will not be used for agriculture this year, but more than 90%, even the preliminary data tells us so, more than 90% of the useful lands will be used. There was a complex of actions taken in this regard. The soils are in normal condition. More than the agrarians are provided with fertilizers and fuel. More than 80%. They use their own resources to accomplish the sowing campaign. But again, we're optimistic about the future from point of view of recovery of economy in general, and the spring agricultural works as well. So I want to extend my appreciation to all the agrarians who don't leave their business. They take care of the food security of Sumy region and Ukraine in general. The majority of the grain will be exported out of our region and maybe even out of Ukraine. Well, the last question, Mr. Taras, about the recovery. It's been more than a year since the liberation of the Sumy region. So within this year, what have you managed to do in terms of recovery, and what are the plans? Thank you for this question. It's an important part of work for us. It's necessary to mention that as of today in Sumy region there are more than 5,000 different installations destroyed. Out of them, about 1/3 was rebuilt. About 1,700 installations were rebuilt. The most part of the destroyed buildings are the private buildings, and the trend is such that they were destroyed due to the shellings that we already mentioned today. So 2,600 out of those 5,000 are private houses. Also, there are educational institutions, infrastructure institutions, apartment blocks, road infrastructure and other infrastructural installations that were destroyed. Our priority are the critical infrastructure in terms of recovery, the power supply infrastructure, for example, the bridges and water supply facilities. This is where we recover in the most intense manner, and we try to protect them against some potential attacks. Another priority is recovery of and reconstruction of the apartment blocks. Within last year, we rebuilt about 260 apartment blocks, mostly in Akhtirka district, which suffered most as a result of the battle operations. As to the private houses, thanks to the government program which was adopted last year, there were construction materials provided which were disseminated around the communities, and that gave another opportunity for reconstruction of the private houses. Also in the Sumy region there is a number of projects being developed, the pilot projects for recovery of the central parts of the small towns, for example Trostianets, and I hope that with the support of the Office of the President and the Agency for Recovery and the Ministry of Recovery, we will be able to implement those projects We will rebuild the squares and recover the property of the citizens and the businesses and the property of the Ukrzaliznytsia, the railway. It's a pilot project that will become exemplary maybe for the region and for other regions, for other territories along the border with Russia. So I want to emphasize that we don't rebuild what was previously, but we try to make it better in terms of inclusiveness, in terms of the infrastructure, energy efficiency. Those projects are being supported by the government, by the First Lady, Olena Zelenska. We have to recover one level above what was before. Mr. Taras, thank you for joining our broadcast. Dear colleagues, joining us was Taras Savchenko, the acting military governor of Sumy region. Our team is working on the schedule for tomorrow, so please follow our announcements. Stay with us, trust in the armed forces, and glory to Ukraine.